The unseen signals. Judge Evelyn Hayes sat at her bench in the large, imposing courtroom, flipping through the case files for the day. It was an ordinary Tuesday afternoon, and the courtroom buzzed with the usual routine. Attorneys preparing arguments, defendants waiting their turn, and spectators filing in and out. The dull hum of legal proceedings enveloped the room. Yet, as the minutes ticked by, Evelyn couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. Her eyes drifted toward a young girl sitting in the back row of the courtroom. She appeared to be no older than 16. Her skin was a deep, beautiful shade of brown, her hair styled in tight curls that framed her face. She was dressed in a plain hoodie and worn-out jeans that seemed too big for her small frame. At first, nothing seemed particularly unusual about her. She sat quietly, her gaze fixed downward, avoiding eye contact with everyone around her. Then Evelyn noticed something strange. The girl's hands were moving almost imperceptibly at first, but then more deliberately. She wasn't fidgeting, nor was she nervous. It looked like she was making some kind of hand signals, her fingers twisting, forming shapes, and moving in rapid succession. It was subtle, but the movements were intentional. Evelyn's curiosity piqued. She leaned forward slightly, narrowing her eyes as she observed the girl more closely. The signals continued, patterns of movement that Evelyn couldn't decipher. The girl's face remained impassive, but her hands never stopped. They communicated something Evelyn couldn't understand. Bailiff, Evelyn called quietly, beckoning her officer over to the bench. The bailiff, a burly man in his mid-40s named Harris, stepped forward, his expression serious. "Yes, Judge." "Do you see that girl over there?" Evelyn asked, nodding subtly toward the back row. "The one making those strange hand movements." Harris squinted in the direction she indicated and nodded. "I see her." "You think she's up to something?" Evelyn wasn't sure. Her instincts told her something was off, but she didn't want to jump to conclusions. Still, in her years on the bench, she had learned to trust her gut. "I'm not sure yet," Evelyn replied, her voice low but firm. "But it's worth checking out. Discreetly, of course." Harris gave a curt nod and moved toward the girl, keeping his approach casual, as if he were simply patrolling the courtroom. Evelyn watched closely as Harris stopped by the girl's row and asked her to step outside for a moment. The girl's reaction was immediate. Her eyes widened and her hands froze mid-signal. She looked startled, even afraid, but she didn't resist. Evelyn followed the exchange carefully. She saw the girl's lips move, but she couldn't hear what was being said. Harris, looking increasingly concerned, gestured for her to follow him. The girl stood up slowly, glancing around the room as if searching for an escape. But instead of bolting, she reluctantly walked toward the exit with Harris. Evelyn's heart pounded in her chest. Something about the girl's demeanor sent alarm bells ringing in her mind. This wasn't the typical behavior of someone who had just been caught doing something wrong. No, this girl looked like she was terrified, not of the law, but of something deeper, something invisible to everyone else. Evelyn rose from her bench, signaling a brief recess. As the courtroom emptied, she made her way to the judge's chambers, where Harris had taken the girl. When Evelyn entered, she found the girl sitting stiffly in a chair, her eyes wide and darting nervously around the room. Harris stood near the door, arms crossed, looking concerned but unsure of what to do next. "What's your name, dear?" Evelyn asked softly, sitting across from the girl, trying to put her at ease. The girl didn't respond immediately. She swallowed hard, her hands trembling in her lap. Finally, she whispered, "Maya." "Maya," Evelyn repeated gently. "Why were you making those hand signals in the courtroom?" Maya's eyes filled with panic, and she shook her head quickly, her hands clenching into fists. "I wasn't. I didn't mean to." Evelyn leaned forward, her voice calm and reassuring. "You're not in trouble, Maya. I just want to understand what's going on. Were you trying to communicate something? Are you in danger?" Maya bit her lip, her gaze flickering toward the door as if she wanted to flee. Evelyn could see the internal battle waging behind the girl's eyes. She was hiding something, something big, but fear held her back. I can't," Maya whispered, tears welling in her eyes. "They'll hurt me." Evelyn's pulse quickened. This was more than a misunderstanding. She glanced at Harris, whose expression mirrored her own concern. "Who will hurt you, Maya?" Evelyn asked, her tone firm but compassionate. "You're safe here. No one can hurt you while you're in this building. I promise." Maya hesitated, her hands twitching slightly as if they wanted to resume the signals, but she stopped herself. She opened her mouth to speak, but the words seemed caught in her throat. Suddenly, there was a sharp knock on the door. Harris opened it cautiously, and a tall, thin man with a stern expression entered the room. He wore an expensive suit and held a briefcase in one hand. The air around him seemed to chill as he stepped inside. "I'm here for my client," the man said, his voice clipped and professional. He turned to Maya with a cold, calculating look. "Maya, it's time to go." Maya's face drained of color and she recoiled in her chair as if the man's very presence filled her with dread. Evelyn's eyes narrowed, her senses on high alert. "And you are?" Evelyn asked, her tone laced with suspicion. Her attorney, the man replied smoothly, pulling out a card and handing it to Harris. "I've been instructed to take her home. There's no need for further questioning." Evelyn glanced at the card, her unease growing. Something about this situation felt wrong, terribly wrong. Maya's reaction to the man wasn't just fear. It was terror. Evelyn had seen it before in victims who had been trapped in abusive situations, unable to speak out because of the consequences. "Maya," Evelyn said, keeping her voice calm but firm. "Do you know this man?" Maya hesitated, her hands shaking again, but she nodded slowly. "Yes, but I don't want to go with him." Evelyn's heart sank. She could see the desperation in Maya's eyes. This was no ordinary legal matter. There was more at stake here than anyone realized. "Then you don't have to," Evelyn said firmly, rising from her seat. "If you feel unsafe, you can stay here. No one is going to force you to leave." The man's eyes darkened and he took a step forward, his voice dangerously low. "I think you're overstepping your bounds, Judge. This is a legal matter." Evelyn stood her ground, her gaze steely. "I don't think so. Not until I know exactly what's going on here." Maya looked between them, her chest heaving with shallow breaths. Her hands twitched and she began making those strange signals again, more frantically this time. Evelyn watched closely, trying to decipher the message hidden in those movements, but before she could figure it out, the door burst open again and 3 police officers stormed in. Unraveling the silence, the tension in the room thickened as the police officers entered, their presence adding to the already charged atmosphere. Judge Evelyn Hayes remained calm, though every instinct screamed that something sinister was unraveling before her eyes. The tall man in the expensive suit, whom Maya had identified but clearly feared, remained unflinching. His eyes darted toward the officers, but his confidence did not waver. He seemed prepared, as though he had anticipated this very moment. "Officers," he said with cold authority, "I assume you're here for the girl. There's been a misunderstanding. She's coming with me." One of the officers, a seasoned man with gray streaks in his hair and a gruff demeanor, glanced toward Judge Hayes for direction. His name tag read Officer Miller. Evelyn gave him a brief, almost imperceptible nod, signaling caution. "Judge Hayes," Officer Miller said, his voice steady, "we received a call about a potential disturbance. Can you clarify the situation?" Evelyn folded her arms, choosing her words carefully. "This young girl, Maya, was exhibiting signs that concerned me during court proceedings. After speaking with her, it became clear she may be in danger. I'm asking that she not be removed from this courthouse until we fully understand what's happening." The suited man's composure cracked slightly and a flicker of irritation crossed his face. "With all due respect, Judge, this is completely inappropriate. Maya is a minor, and I have legal guardianship over her. You have no grounds to keep her here." At the mention of guardianship, Evelyn's suspicions deepened. Her gaze shifted back to Maya, who sat rigid, her trembling hands clutching the arms of her chair so tightly her knuckles turned white. She glanced at the officers, then back at Evelyn, her silent plea almost palpable. Evelyn took a deep breath, knowing that this moment could determine the course of the girl's future. "Guardianship or not," she said, her voice firm, "this is a legal proceeding, and I have the authority to detain anyone I believe is in immediate danger. Until we're certain Maya is safe, she's staying here." The man's eyes hardened, his facade of professionalism slipping further. He opened his mouth to protest, but before he could speak, Maya's hands started moving again, more frantically this time. Her fingers twisted into shapes as if she was trying to communicate something urgently. Evelyn's eyes zeroed in on the movements. They were not random. These signals had meaning, though it was clear now that Maya had been trying to conceal them from the man in the suit. "Maya," Evelyn said gently, her tone coaxing, "what are you trying to tell us? You can use your words if you're ready, or keep making those signals. We're listening." Maya's hands paused, hovering in the air. Her eyes, wide and frightened, flickered toward the man and then to the officers. She was trapped in her own silence, unable to speak out loud for reasons that Evelyn could only imagine. But those signals, there was a story in them, something crucial. And then it clicked. Evelyn had seen hand signals like this before, but not in a courtroom setting. She'd encountered them in training courses for law enforcement, social work, and domestic violence prevention. The signals were part of a code used by victims who couldn't openly call for help. Evelyn's breath caught as realization dawned on her. "Maya," she said softly, locking eyes with the girl, "are you trying to tell us that you're not safe?" Maya hesitated, her hands frozen in midair as if deciding whether to trust Evelyn. Slowly, with trembling fingers, she nodded once, just barely enough to be seen. The room seemed to still, the weight of Maya's silent admission settling over everyone present. The man in the suit noticed the shift in mood and stepped forward, his voice sharp and commanding. This is absurd. She's my responsibility and you're all making a grave mistake. I demand that you release her to me immediately." Officer Miller exchanged a glance with his colleagues, their postures becoming more alert. "Sir, we need to take a moment to assess the situation," Miller said cautiously. "We're going to need more information from you about your relationship with Maya and her legal status." The man's face darkened further, his patience clearly wearing thin. "My relationship? This is preposterous. I'm her legal guardian. She's been in my care for months. You have no right to keep her here." Evelyn remained calm but vigilant. "You're going to have to show proof of guardianship and we'll also need to speak with Maya privately. If everything checks out, you'll be free to go. But until then, she stays here." Maya's eyes flitted toward the door, her breathing rapid and shallow. Evelyn could see the panic rising in her again, the fear of what would happen if she was forced to leave with this man. It was becoming clearer that Maya wasn't just in a bad situation. She was in imminent danger. Suddenly, the door opened again and a second man walked in. He was younger than the first man, with slicked-back hair and air of authority. He wore a dark jacket that barely covered the edge of a badge clipped to his belt. "Detective Kerrigan," he introduced himself quickly, flashing his badge. "I've been working on a case involving Maya here for the past few months. There's been an ongoing investigation into her guardian's activities, and I believe we're finally getting somewhere." The man in the suit stiffened, his expression shifting to something more guarded. "What is this about? I haven't been informed of any investigation." Detective Kerrigan gave him a cold, measured look. "That's because it's been a cover operation. We've been trying to gather evidence without raising alarm, but now it looks like things are coming to a head." Evelyn's eyes widened. "What kind of case are we talking about here?" Kerrigan glanced at Maya, then back at the officers. "Human trafficking. We've had suspicions that Maya is one of several young girls being exploited under the guise of guardianship. But until now, we didn't have enough to go on. I believe Maya has been trying to signal for help, which is exactly why she's been so scared to speak openly." Maya's face turned pale, but there was a glimmer of something in her eyes. Hope, perhaps, or relief. She glanced down at her hands as if wondering if her signals had finally been understood. The man in the suit sneered, though his composed demeanor was starting to crack. "This is a baseless accusation. You have no evidence. I'll have my lawyers here in minutes and you'll all regret this." Detective Kerrigan didn't flinch. "You're free to call your lawyers, but the fact remains that Maya's safety is our priority. We have reason to believe she's been coerced and exploited, and that means we'll take every step necessary to protect her." Officer Miller took a step forward, his hand resting casually on the holster at his side. "Sir, I'm going to ask you to stay right where you are. We're not making any rash moves here, but we need to get to the bottom of this." The man's confidence seemed to waver for the first time. His eyes flickered toward Maya, who sat frozen in her chair, her entire body trembling. Evelyn could sense that things were about to escalate. "Maya," Evelyn said gently, hoping to draw her out of her fear, "you're safe now. You don't have to go with him. We'll make sure of that." For a long moment, Maya didn't move. Her hands twitched, hovering in the air like they were on the verge of signaling again. Then, as if breaking through a dam of fear, she whispered, "He's lying. I'm not his daughter. I don't belong to him." The room fell into stunned silence as her words hung in the air. Evelyn exchanged a glance with Detective Kerrigan, whose jaw tightened in response. This was the breakthrough they had been waiting for. Maya's confession, though quiet, was the crack that would soon shatter the entire web of lies surrounding her. Cracks in the facade, the silence that followed Maya's confession was deafening. Judge Evelyn Hayes felt the weight of the moment pressing on her, as if the room itself was holding its breath. Maya, the fragile girl who had been making those cryptic signals in the courtroom, had finally broken through her silence. Her quiet words, "I'm not his daughter," echoed in Evelyn's mind, carrying with them years of pain and fear. The suited man who had introduced himself as Maya's guardian stood frozen, his previously confident facade beginning to crack. His jaw clenched, and he took a step forward, his voice dripping with venom. "This is ridiculous. She's confused. You're letting a traumatized child manipulate this situation." Detective Kerrigan, who had just revealed the ongoing human trafficking investigation, didn't flinch. His eyes remained locked on the man. "It's not manipulation when someone is trying to escape a nightmare, and we have plenty of evidence that suggests Maya's not the only one involved in this." Evelyn watched as Maya trembled in her chair, her hands clenched tightly in her lap. The signals had stopped, but the terror in her eyes was unmistakable. Evelyn's heart ached for the girl, knowing that this was just the beginning of what might be a long and painful unraveling of her story. "Let's not jump to conclusions just yet," Evelyn said, her voice calm but authoritative. She turned to Officer Miller. "We need to take this slowly and carefully. Maya, I want you to know that you're safe here. No one can force you to go anywhere against your will." Maya's lips trembled, but she gave a tiny nod. Evelyn could see the exhaustion in her eyes. The kind that came from years of living in fear, constantly looking over your shoulder, never knowing who to trust. She couldn't begin to imagine what horrors this girl had faced. The man's composure finally snapped. "This is outrageous. You're taking the word of a child over a legal guardian with documents to prove it. This is unlawful, and I won't stand for it." Detective Kerrigan folded his arms across his chest, his expression cool and unyielding. "We've been investigating your so-called guardianship for months. We kept everything perfectly legal on paper, but behind the scenes, it's a different story. We've had suspicions for a while now, but Maya's courage today confirms what we feared." The man's face darkened, his anger boiling just beneath the surface. "You have no proof." Evelyn stepped forward, sensing that things were about to escalate. "We'll get to the bottom of this. If your guardianship is legitimate, you have nothing to worry about. But until we can verify everything, Maya stays here." The man took a deep breath, visibly trying to rein in his fury. He cast a cold, calculating glance toward Maya, and for the first time, Evelyn saw a flicker of something more than frustration. It was the look of someone who had lost control, who was watching their carefully constructed world crumble around them. Evelyn's instincts flared. There was no doubt in her mind now. This man was dangerous, and Maya was terrified of him for good reason. "I'm calling my lawyer," the man said sharply, pulling out his phone and stepping toward the door. "This is a violation of my rights, and I'll have your badge for this," he added, glaring at Detective Kerrigan. "Go ahead," Kerrigan replied calmly, "but we both know that once this case sees the light of day, no lawyer in the world will be able to save you." The man disappeared through the door, slamming it behind him. For a moment, the room was still, the tension hanging heavy in the air. Maya's breathing was shallow, her entire body trembling as if she were bracing for something terrible. Evelyn crouched down in front of her, lowering her voice to a soothing tone. "Maya, I know this is overwhelming, but you've been incredibly brave. You don't have to be afraid anymore. We're going to protect you." Maya blinked back tears, her lips parting as if she wanted to speak but couldn't find the words. Slowly, her hands began to move again, signaling something Evelyn didn't fully understand but knew was important. Evelyn glanced at Detective Kerrigan. "Do we have anyone here who can interpret sign language?" Kerrigan shook his head. "I don't think that's ASL," he said. "It looks more like a survival signal, something she picked up along the way." Maya's hands continued to move more deliberately now. It wasn't just random gestures. It was a message, something she was trying to convey without using her voice. Evelyn's mind raced, trying to recall anything she'd learned in her training that could help decipher what Maya was saying. "Maya," Evelyn said gently, "we don't fully understand your signals yet, but we're listening. Take your time." Maya paused, her hands still trembling, but there was a shift in her demeanor. Something small but significant. She looked down at her lap, her lips barely moving as she whispered, "There are more." Evelyn's heart skipped a beat. "More? Do you mean there are other children like you?" Maya nodded, her eyes filling with tears. They're still with him." Evelyn's blood ran cold. This was bigger than she had imagined. Maya wasn't just a victim. She was a witness to something much larger, something far more horrifying. If what Maya was saying was true, then there were other children trapped in the same nightmare, and time was running out to save them. Evelyn turned to Detective Kerrigan, her voice urgent. "We need to act now. If there are others, they could be in immediate danger." Kerrigan's expression hardened and he nodded. "I'll get a warrant and contact my team. We've been waiting for confirmation and now we have it. We can't let him slip away." As Kerrigan moved to make the necessary calls, Officer Miller approached Maya, kneeling beside her. "You're doing great, kid. We're going to find those other kids and bring them to safety, just like we're doing for you." Maya wiped at her eyes with the sleeve of her oversized hoodie, nodding shakily. There was still so much fear in her eyes, but for the first time there was also a glimmer of hope. Evelyn stood, her mind racing through the possibilities. They needed to move quickly, but they also had to be careful. If the man realized they were onto him, he might take drastic measures, especially if there were other children involved. Just as she was about to follow Detective Kerrigan out of the room, her phone buzzed. It was an emergency notification from the courthouse security. The man, the supposed guardian, had disappeared. Evelyn's heart sank. He hadn't just left to call his lawyer. He fled. "Kerrigan," she called out urgently, "he's gone. He's slipped out." Kerrigan cursed under his breath. "He knows we're onto him. We need to issue an alert and lock down any routes out of the city." Evelyn nodded, her pulse quickening. "We need to find him before he gets to those other children." Maya's eyes widened in panic at the news, her body tensing as if she were about to bolt. "He's going to take them," she whispered, barely audible. "He's going to hide them where you'll never find them." Evelyn knelt in front of Maya again, taking her hands gently. "We're not going to let that happen, Maya. You've helped us more than you know, and now we're going to do everything in our power to find them." Maya shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "You don't understand. He has places. He'll disappear. Evelyn squeezed Maya's hands. Then we need you to help us stop him. Do you know where he might go? Anything you can tell us could make the difference. Maya hesitated, biting her lip, but then she closed her eyes as if summoning all her courage. Slowly, she began to speak, her voice trembling but clear. There's a house. Outside the city. That's where they are. I can show you. Evelyn exchanged a glance with Detective Kerrigan, who gave a curt nod. It was the break they needed. We'll go, Evelyn said softly, and we'll bring them back. But Maya, you're staying safe here. No one will hurt you again. Maya nodded, but her eyes were filled with the kind of pain that couldn't be soothed with words alone. Evelyn knew that this was far from over, but they had to act fast. As they prepared to leave, Evelyn couldn't shake the haunting thought that the man had been so close to slipping away with his secrets, and the children who still remained in the shadows. Racing against the clock, the courthouse buzzed with frenetic energy as word spread of the man's escape. Officers moved swiftly, coordinating with local authorities to seal off exits from the city, while Detective Kerrigan worked urgently to issue a statewide alert. Judge Evelyn Hayes, though shaken, maintained her calm composure, her mind focused on one thing: the children still trapped in the sinister world Maya had just revealed. Evelyn glanced over at Maya, who sat huddled on the edge of the bench in the courthouse security room. The young girl was visibly shaking, her hands twisted in her lap, and her eyes darting nervously toward the door. The weight of the situation was pressing down on her, threatening to overwhelm whatever strength she had left. But Evelyn had seen something in Maya, a resilience born from surviving the unimaginable. We're going to find them, Maya, Evelyn said softly, sitting beside her. But we need your help. Anything you can tell us about that house, anything at all, could save them. Maya blinked up at Evelyn, her voice barely audible. It's outside the city. It's hidden in the woods away from the main road. I have only been there once, but I know they keep the others there. The ones who haven't been taken yet. Evelyn's stomach churned at the implication. The children hadn't been taken yet, meaning they were waiting, trapped in some nightmarish limbo until it was their turn. She fought to keep her face neutral, not wanting to show Maya just how terrifying the situation had become. Detective Kerrigan approached, his phone still pressed to his ear. He gestured for Evelyn to follow him to the corner of the room. Judge, we've locked down the nearby highways and are running surveillance on bus stations, airports, anywhere he might try to escape from. But if he's as slick as we think, he could have already slipped through. What about the house Maya mentioned? Evelyn asked, her voice low. Do we have any leads? Kerrigan nodded grimly. We set units out toward the rural areas she described, but it's like finding a needle in a haystack. There are dozens of abandoned properties in those woods, and without more specific coordinates, it could take hours, maybe even days, to locate the right one. Evelyn's pulse quickened. We don't have days. If he knows we're onto him, he'll move the kids or worse. We can't afford to waste any time. Kerrigan ran a hand through his hair, his frustration evident. Believe me, I know. I've got officers combing through real estate records and property titles, but if he's been operating under the radar, there's a good chance none of it will lead back to him. Evelyn looked back at Maya, her mind racing. The girl had been living in fear for months, maybe longer, and she had finally found the courage to speak out. Now they needed to trust that Maya's memory of the house could guide them, even if her knowledge was limited. Maya, Evelyn said, returning to the girl's side, we're going to need more details. I know it's hard, but try to remember anything about the house. What did it look like? What kind of surroundings were there? Maya frowned, her face tightening as she struggled to recall. It was old, like the kind of house that hasn't been lived in for a long time. It had green shutters, I think. And there were trees everywhere, really tall ones, so you couldn't see it from the road. There was a barn too, but it was falling apart. Evelyn nodded, filing away every piece of information. It wasn't much, but it was a start. Did you hear anything while you were there? Cars, airplanes, anything that might help us pinpoint the location. Maya bit her lip, her gaze distant as she tried to remember. It was quiet. I didn't hear much except for the wind and birds, I think. It felt really isolated. I don't know if this helps. There was a pond nearby. I could see it through the trees. Evelyn turned to Kerrigan, who had been taking notes. He gave a tight nod. I'll have my team focus on properties near water sources. It's a small lead, but it's something. As Kerrigan moved to leave the room, the door swung open and Officer Miller stepped in, his face grim. Judge Hayes, we got a problem. The man, he was spotted near the train station downtown, but he slipped through our net. He's on the move. Evelyn felt a jolt of anxiety spike through her. How long ago? About 20 minutes, Miller said. We're running surveillance on the area, but he could be anywhere by now. Evelyn clenched her fists, trying to think of a way to stay one step ahead. The man had proven to be slippery, and now that he knew they were onto him, he would go to ground fast. And the children, they were in immediate danger. Just then, Maya stood up abruptly, her small frame tense with panic. "He's going to hide them," she said, her voice shaking. "He'll move them to a place where you'll never find them." "That's what he always said, that he could disappear and no one would ever find us." Evelyn's heart broke at Maya's words. This man had clearly been controlling every aspect of her life with threats of vanishing, leaving her to believe she could be taken away at any moment, and no one would ever come for her. "We'll find them, Maya," Evelyn said, though the weight of the situation made her feel the fragility of that promise. "But we need your help to do that." Maya took a deep breath, her brow furrowed in concentration. "There's one more thing. I didn't remember it until now." There was a sign near the road that led to the house. It was broken, but it had the name of a farm or something. I couldn't read the whole thing, but I think it started with Haw or Hall. Kerrigan quickly jotted it down. "I'll cross-reference it with any nearby properties. That could narrow down the search." Evelyn glanced at the clock. Time was slipping away and every second counted. The man was on the run, and the children's lives were hanging in the balance. "We need to go," Evelyn said firmly, turning to Kerrigan and Miller. "We can't wait for more leads to surface. If Maya's right and he's planning to disappear, then this might be our only shot." Kerrigan nodded, his jaw set in determination. "We'll assemble a team. We'll need Maya to guide us as best she can." Maya hesitated, fear flickering in her eyes. "I don't know if I can remember everything. It's been so long." Evelyn knelt beside her, looking the girl directly in the eyes. "You've been brave enough to come this far, Maya, and I believe you have the strength to help us find those other children. You're not alone in this." Tears welled up in Maya's eyes, and for a moment, it seemed like the weight of everything was too much for her. But then slowly she nodded. "I'll try." Kerrigan and Miller moved quickly, coordinating a tactical team and mapping out potential routes to the area Maya had described. As they prepared to leave, Evelyn stayed close to Maya, offering quiet reassurances. The drive out to the woods felt endless. Evelyn sat in the front of the unmarked car, the silence thick with tension. Maya sat in the back seat, nervously fidgeting with the hem of her jacket, her eyes darting out the window as they passed through miles of dense forest. "Does any of this look familiar?" Kerrigan asked, his eyes scanning the road. Maya squinted at the passing trees. "I think so. It's hard to tell. Everything looks the same." Evelyn glanced at Kerrigan. He kept his expression neutral, but she could see the worry lines etched into his forehead. They were running on thin leads and even thinner time. "Wait." Maya suddenly sat up straighter, pointing toward a narrow, overgrown path just ahead. "That's it. I think that's the road." Kerrigan pulled the car to a stop, signaling to the other vehicles following behind. "We'll move in on foot from here," he said, grabbing his radio to alert the team. The officers moved swiftly but quietly, forming a tight perimeter as they approached the hidden property. The trees closed in around them, their branches casting long shadows that danced in the fading light. The sense of urgency pressed down on all of them. Evelyn's heart pounded in her chest as they rounded a corner, and there it was, a dilapidated house with green shutters, just as Maya had described. The barn stood a short distance away, half collapsed and covered in overgrown vines. "Stay close," Kerrigan whispered, signaling the team to spread out. They crept toward the house, every step slow and deliberate. The silence was deafening, save for the crunch of leaves beneath their feet and the distant rustle of wind through the trees. And then suddenly, a voice rang out from inside the house. A deep, angry voice, followed by the sound of children crying. Evelyn's blood ran cold. Kerrigan raised his hand, signaling for everyone to take positions. Evelyn's heart raced as a desperate stand. The woods felt alive with tension as the officers, Judge Evelyn Hayes and Maya stood in the dense shadows of the towering trees. The ramshackle house in front of them loomed like a ghostly figure, its green shutters crooked and hanging on by mere hinges. The barn nearby was crumbling, an eerie relic of a past long forgotten, its wooden beams half-rotted and vines choking what was left. Evelyn's heart thundered in her chest as she crouched behind a tree, her breath shallow. She could still hear the faint echo of children crying from inside the house, their terrified voices sending chills down her spine. Next to her, Maya stood frozen, her eyes wide with fear, but resolute. Detective Kerrigan raised a hand, signaling the officers to spread out. "We'll move in quietly," he whispered. "No sudden movements. If he hears us, he might try to hurt the children or flee with them. We need to be ready for anything." Evelyn nodded in agreement, her gaze focused on the house. This was it. After months of Maya suffering in silence, after weeks of doubt and danger, they were finally at the brink of freeing those children, and possibly putting an end to this man's reign of terror. But there was no room for error. The stakes couldn't be higher. Maya tugged gently on Evelyn's sleeve, her small voice trembling. "He's dangerous. He has a gun. I've seen it. He always keeps it near him." Evelyn's throat tightened at the thought of what could go wrong. She had seen too many courtroom cases turn deadly in an instant, but there was no turning back now. These children were depending on them. Kerrigan motioned for two officers to flank the house from the sides while the rest of the team approached from the front. The woods swallowed the sounds of their footsteps and the group moved in eerie silence, the only sound the wind rustling through the trees and the distant chirping of birds. As they neared the front door and the crying inside grew louder, a desperate wail that cut through the air like a blade. Evelyn's pulse quickened and her hands balled into fists as she steeled herself for what was to come. Kerrigan motioned toward the door, signaling to breach. Two officers moved swiftly, positioning themselves on either side, their weapons drawn. Time seemed to slow as Kerrigan gave a final nod and the officers kicked the door in with a loud crash. The door splintered inward, revealing the dark interior of the house. The team surged inside, weapons raised, their eyes sweeping the dimly lit room. Evelyn stayed back with Maya, gripping her arm protectively as they entered behind the officers. The smell of mold and decay filled the air, thick and oppressive. The house was a maze of narrow hallways, peeling wallpaper, and broken furniture. Everything about it felt wrong, as if it had been abandoned by the world long ago, and now served as a cage for the innocent. "Clear," one of the officers called from the front room. Clear came another voice from a back hallway, but the crying hadn't stopped. The sound was coming from a locked door at the far end of the hallway. Kerrigan stepped forward, signaling for silence as he approached the door. He motioned for one of the officers to pick the lock, but before they could move, a loud bang rang out from inside. The sound of a heavy object hitting the floor made the officers freeze. "Stay back." A deep, menacing voice shouted from behind the door. "I'll kill them. I swear to God, I'll kill them all." Evelyn's heart sank. The man was inside with the children, and he was desperate. Desperate people made dangerous choices. She exchanged a look with Kerrigan, who gritted his teeth in frustration. They needed to act fast, but they couldn't risk the children's lives by barging in. "Let me talk to him," Evelyn whispered, stepping forward. Kerrigan hesitated, his brow furrowed. "Judge Hayes, this guy's unstable. We can't let you go in there." "I don't have to go in. Just let me speak to him," she insisted. "He knows the law, and maybe if he thinks there's a way out for him, he won't do anything rash." After a tense moment, Kerrigan nodded. He motioned for the officers to hold their positions, and Evelyn stepped closer to the door. Her voice was calm and steady, though her nerves were frayed. "You don't want to hurt those kids," she called out gently, her voice carrying through the heavy door. "Whatever you've done, it's not too late to stop this. You can end it right now." Silence followed, and for a moment, Evelyn wondered if the man was considering her words or if he was preparing to make his final move. "I got nothing left to lose," the man's voice came through, shaky but still filled with malice. "They'll never let me go. They'll lock me away forever." Evelyn took a deep breath, choosing her next words carefully. "You're right. They will. But what happens here, right now, will decide if it gets worse. You don't want to add murder to your charges. You can still walk out of here alive, and so can they." The door creaked, and there was a low, guttural sound from the other side. "You don't know what it's like, what I've done to survive. They don't understand. None of you do." Evelyn's heart twisted. "You're right, we don't know your whole story. But if you give yourself up, there's a chance for redemption, for you and for those kids." The man's voice softened, as if something in her words had struck a chord. "Redemption? There's no redemption for someone like me." A small cry came from behind the door, a child's whimper, and Evelyn knew she had to keep pushing. "You're scared. I can hear it in your voice. But you can stop this. Let the kids go. Let's talk. I'm a judge. I can make sure you're heard." There was a long pause. The air felt thick with uncertainty, as if the man was weighing his options, teetering on the edge of surrender and chaos. Then the door handle rattled. For a split second, hope surged through Evelyn. But then, just as quickly, it was dashed. "I won't go back to prison," the man shouted, his voice cracking with hysteria. There was another loud bang, and the sound of children screaming pierced the air. "Move," Kerrigan barked, signaling the officers to storm the room. In a flash, the officers kicked down the door, rushing in with their weapons drawn. The sight that greeted them was horrifying. The man stood in the middle of the room, clutching a handgun in one hand and a small boy in the other, using him as a human shield. The room was cluttered with old furniture, broken toys, and dirty mattresses where the children had been kept. Several other kids huddled in a corner, their tear-streaked faces frozen in terror. "Put the gun down," one of the officers shouted, taking a step closer. "It's over. Let the boy go." But the man's eyes were wild, his grip tightening on the child's arm. He looked like a cornered animal, ready to lash out in a final act of desperation. Evelyn could see the fear in his eyes, mixed with rage and hopelessness. He had gone too far, and now there was no turning back. "Don't do this," Evelyn called out, her voice shaking with urgency. "Think of those kids, let them live. You don't have to end it like this." The man hesitated for a split second, his hand trembling on the gun. But then, in a blur of motion, he raised the weapon toward the officers. The shot rang out before anyone could react. The room exploded into chaos as the officers returned fire, the sound deafening in the confined space. Evelyn's heart pounded in her chest as she watched in horror, praying that the children weren't caught in the crossfire. When the gunfire finally stopped, the man lay crumpled on the floor, blood pooling beneath him. His grip on the boy had loosened, and the child scrambled away, tears streaming down his face. Evelyn rushed forward, her legs shaky as she moved toward the children huddled in the corner. "It's okay," she whispered, her voice breaking with emotion. "You're safe now." The children clung to her, their small bodies trembling in her arms. Behind her, the officers moved quickly, securing the scene and checking on the wounded. But in that moment, all Evelyn could think about were the lives that had been shattered, and the long road to healing that lay ahead for these children, Maya included. Healing wounds and new beginnings. The next few days blurred together for Evelyn. The events of the raid haunted her mind, replaying the final moments over and over again. The fear in the children's eyes, the man's final act of desperation, and the gunshot that sealed his fate. It was a weight she couldn't shake, even as the world around her carried on. She found herself in the courthouse once more, sitting behind her desk, but this time the usual hum of activity in the courtroom felt distant. The work that had always filled her with purpose now seemed hollow, a reminder of how fragile the line between justice and tragedy could be. Every document she signed, every case she reviewed felt tainted by the memory of that man's broken life and the children's stolen innocence. Maya had been placed in protective care after the raid, and Evelyn hadn't heard from her since. The little girl had become a symbol of resilience in Evelyn's mind, but also of the fragility of youth, caught in the throes of an adult world that was far too cruel. She wondered how Maya was doing, how she was coping after everything she'd been through. A part of Evelyn felt responsible for her, as if by uncovering the truth, she had opened a Pandora's box that Maya had been forced to live with. Detective Kerrigan had visited her office a few times, briefing her on the fallout from the raid. The media had gotten wind of the operation, and headlines were ablaze with stories of the hero judge who had helped save kidnapped children. But Evelyn recoiled at the idea of being called a hero. In her mind, she had simply done what was necessary, what anyone with a conscience would have done. There were no heroes in this story, only victims who needed justice. Judge Hayes? Evelyn was startled out of her thoughts by the soft knock on her office door. It was one of the courthouse clerks, a young woman with a tentative expression. "There's someone here to see you." Evelyn blinked, confused. She wasn't expecting anyone. "Who is it?" The clerk hesitated. "It's Maya." The words hit her like a bolt of lightning. "Maya? What was she doing here?" "Send her in," Evelyn said, her voice tight with surprise. She quickly straightened the papers on her desk, though her mind was racing. When the door opened again, Maya stepped inside, her small frame almost swallowed by the oversized coat she wore. She looked different, more fragile, but also stronger, as if the weight of her experiences had aged her in ways that no child should have to endure. "Hi, Judge Hayes," Maya said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. Evelyn stood up, her heart swelling with emotion. "Maya," she breathed, walking over to the girl and kneeling down to meet her at eye level. "How are you? Are you okay?" Maya nodded, but the look in her eyes told a different story. She had been through more than any child should, and the scars, both physical and emotional, were still fresh. But there was a quiet determination in her gaze, something that hadn't been there before. "They told me I'd to come see you," Maya said, shifting nervously. I wanted to thank you." Evelyn's throat tightened. "You don't have to thank me. Maya, what happened wasn't your fault." Maya's eyes welled with tears, but she blinked them back, her voice trembling. "But you believed me. You saw me when no one else did. If it wasn't for you, those kids, they might still be with him." Evelyn felt a lump rise in her throat. She reached out and gently took Maya's hands, holding them in her own. "You were the one who was brave, Maya. You did something so incredibly courageous by trying to help those children. You saved them." For a moment, they sat in silence, the weight of their shared experience binding them together. Evelyn could see the battle that still raged within Maya, the guilt, the fear, the confusion. She knew it would take time, perhaps years, for Maya to fully heal from what she had been through. "I'm going to be okay," Maya said softly, as if trying to convince herself as much as she was convincing Evelyn. "I'm staying with the foster family now. They're nice." Evelyn smiled, though her heart ached for the young girl. "I'm glad to hear that. You deserve to be with people who care about you." Maya hesitated, biting her lip before speaking again. "I think about them sometimes. The other kids. Do you think they'll be okay too?" Evelyn's smile faltered slightly, but she nodded. "I hope so, Maya. They have a long road ahead of them, but with the right help, they'll be able to heal, just like you. Maya's eyes dropped to the floor, her hands fidgeting in Evelyn's grasp. I miss my mom, she whispered. The confession hung in the air like a heavy cloud. Evelyn knew that Maya's mother, though not physically abusive, had failed her in so many ways. She had allowed the trauma to fester, had ignored her daughter's cries for help, and had exposed her to unimaginable danger. But Evelyn also understood the complicated nature of a child's love. No matter how much pain her mother had caused, Maya still longed for her approval, her presence, her love. I know you do, Evelyn said gently. It's okay to miss her. It's okay to feel confused about it. But you have to take care of yourself now. You deserve to feel safe and loved. Maya nodded, though her expression remained conflicted. It was clear that the battle inside her heart was far from over. But Evelyn had faith that Maya would find her way, just as she had found the courage to stand up for those children. She had a strength inside her that most adults would never understand. As the weeks turned into months, life in the courthouse slowly returned to normal for Evelyn, though the events of that fateful day in the woods remained etched in her mind. The case surrounding the man who had kidnapped the children was closed, but the echoes of the trauma lingered, not just for the victims, but for everyone involved. One afternoon, several months after Maya's visit, Evelyn received an envelope in the mail. It was addressed to her personally, with no return address. Curious, she opened it and found a small card inside. The handwriting was shaky but familiar. Thank you for seeing me, for believing in me when no one else did. I'm getting stronger every day. Maybe one day I'll come visit you again. I want to show you that I can make it through this. I'm going to be okay. You helped me see that I could be. Love, Maya. Tears welled up in Evelyn's eyes as she read the letter, her heart swelling with pride and hope. Maya's journey was far from over, but she was healing. She was finding her way just as Evelyn had hoped she would. Evelyn folded the letter carefully and placed it in her desk drawer, a reminder of the quiet victories that often went unnoticed in the pursuit of justice. Sometimes the most important battles weren't fought in the courtroom, but in the hearts of those who had been broken, and in the lives of those who dared to believe in redemption. As she looked out of her office window, watching the sun set over the city skyline, Evelyn felt a sense of peace wash over her. The world was far from perfect, but in the midst of the chaos and the pain, there was still hope. And that, she realized, was the truest form of justice there could ever be.